the privacy rights, the...
Well, the difficulty I had encountered was that from the very inception at AT&T, I was plunged into all sorts of fascinating legal excursions and activities, and particularly in 1965 on, when I went into AT&T headquarters as the senior counsel in charge of national security matters, criminal law matters, electronic surveillance,
Mm-hmm.
and privacy matters, which was sort of the flip side of the coin. And I also served as the chief spokesman, did a great deal of testifying before Congress. So I actually had closed that chapter when I had left Nuremberg. Not that I had any desire to close it because it was not a grand experience, but because there were other things to go into.
Did you find that coming from Nuremberg and having that on your resume was a positive or a negative?
That's a good question. I would think probably in general it was a positive, although at the time I returned in late 1949 or so, or not, yes, the general the general attitude toward the Nuremberg trials was very problematic,
Mm-hmm.
and I could go into that in more detail now if you'd like as to why, or we could touch on it later.
Let's touch on it a little bit later.
Yes.
So here we are again, going chronologically. By the way, you have some water?
Yes.
Your wife is kind of sure.
Would you care for any?
Oh, I'm fine.
Would you care for anything?
No, fine.
This
thank
is
you.
such a hoot. You find yourself on a mad dash, if you will, between end of the trial and the IMT trial and getting just some much of evidence that you could possibly get from the potential soon-to-be decedents, if you will, and other witnesses. Were some of the witnesses released after the first IMT trial? Like their reason for being there was principally to act as witnesses?
Well, a number of in fact, probably most of the German governmental and military witnesses were also prisoners,
Mm-hmm.
and some who were cooperating thought, in many cases it turned out, that there would be a quid pro quo for their cooperation, and a number of the generals, for example, who Goering castigated when they testified against him. He called them traitors, Schweinhunds, and other favorable names. But we had quite a mixture, because you also had many witnesses who were from the occupied territories and who were victims. We had the cooperation, I might point this out, from the very inception of key figures from many of the occupied countries. And I particularly was very strongly supported by their cooperation, because most of the figures involved in the Foreign Office case were diplomats. And those that worked with government. For example, I was very close to the Czech delegation.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I had a perfect entree, having been in Prague for several times, although on a non-intellectual basis.
Right.
When I was a student, and we worked very closely with a number of the Dutch and the English Foreign Office, and I had some very interesting experiences. Some of the senior counsel, particularly at the first trial, had tried to persuade certain dignitaries to testify at Nuremberg, and they turned them down. And I remember that I had heard that efforts, for example, to get Francois Poncet, who was the French ambassador at the time, and several of the former prime ministers, premiers of France, to testify, and they were turned down. They wouldn't come to Nuremberg. And this was sort of a discordant note. And I volunteered finally. I said, well, perhaps a younger person might have some luck, you know, nothing else. They would approve of my enthusiasm.
Sure.
One of my subtle and not so subtle reasons was the prospect of going to Paris and spending a week or so there.
Sure.
And so I finally, after 2 or 3 had failed, I was given the opportunity and went there, and you know, I'm forgetting the names now. The last premier of France, and the one who was more or less a peasant stock, and their mistresses, they were always maintaining rival salons. Well, anyway, it'll probably come to me in a minute. Just blanked out. But I managed to go there, and I called the I should remember it, and I don't. But I'm terrible on names. Anyway, I've always been that way. You probably could point out the last premier.
Actually, it wasn't Poincaré, was it? Poincaré? Poincaré? P-O-I-N-C-A-R-E?
No. Well, anyway, when I went to Paris, I called him and I said told him who I was, and I said I understand that a number of people had come to try and persuade you to talk on the Nuremberg Trials and perhaps give a statement, or if not appear, at least give a statement. And he was very courteous. He spoke quite good English. And I said, now, one thing I would appreciate, I said, I'd like to have lunch with you.
Mm-hmm.
But I would really welcome the fact that you wouldn't ask me to lunch for about 5 days. And he said, why was that? And I said, very honestly, that would give me 5 days in Paris. So he liked that. He said, so we set up a luncheon, and he had a lovely apartment on the French bank,
mm-hmm.
near the chamber, on the left bank near the Chamber of Deputies.
Yeah, because after the trial, then of course you have what turns out to be 12 cases,
Yes.
12 subsequent cases. Did you know there was going to be 12 cases at that time? Did Telford Taylor says, all right, here's how we're going to spread this out?
No. At first, there were no cases. There were, you might say, preparation for cases.
Right.
And there were groups assigned to each area. For example, the first trial was sort of an impromptu one. If I remember first, the Milch trial was the first trial, and he was a single defendant. And I think Henry King was involved in that, but
Milch. He was involved in the Milch case, yeah.
But actually, that was a sort of a stopgap measure, because I don't think any of the other cases were prepared.
Right.
And that was the reason Milch was tried as a sole defendant, too. It was merely to not have an embarrassing gap.
Right.
And of course, the preparations for a second international trial were still being considered. And if I remember correctly, Jackson had agreed at first to consider a second trial, but we were not enthusiastic about it. And that is a trial in which there would be 4 powers sitting.
Right.
And finally, those negotiations fell through. But at the time, we started out by concentrating on areas. For example, the group I was with, Political Ministries Division, was interested in political ministers. Not only, you may recall at our trial, not only did we have about 8 members of the Foreign Office, starting with the State Secretaries von Weizsäcker and von Steengraaf von Moyland, but we also had the Minister of Agriculture, Daré, the Minister of Finance, Schwerin von Krosigk, Peters, Stucker, Dietrich, all men who were involved in the government, you might say. So that was one of the areas of our concentration. And the group that I was working with worked not only on the Foreign Office, but on the development of case against some of those others. And it was sort of the gathering of evidence was a very difficult process. For example, in the Foreign Office case, you had the files of the Foreign Office in Berlin, which were extremely voluminous. And we almost discovered a surprise of the day, with the evidence flowing in. And actually, the difficulty in part was that we as lawyers were not actually participating in the gathering of the evidence. And there was always the uncertainty whether you had all the evidence.
Right.
And in fact, our trial, which the 12th trial, was a reprise of the first trial in many respects, but with much more evidence. We had more evidence than they did, and more insight into what had actually taken place.
I think you mentioned that. I'm taking this from the report of the atrocities conference you were at with Peter McGuire. You participated, and you said the case was the largest, the longest, and the last of the post-IMT trials to be concluded. Some 160 court sessions later, in 17 months, judgment was rendered. The total record included counsel briefs, ran to 79,000 pages. The judgment itself consisted of 692 pages. How do you keep track of all of this? It's a massive undertaking.
Well, it really you got to be so conversant with the subject matter, and you as a lawyer would appreciate that. But after you get immersed in one of these big cases, you really are amazed at the amount of information that you were able to mop up.
Right.
And I think the fact that a number of us were younger, but guided with mentors who were much senior, enabled us to handle this. We also had some very good staff. We had investigators, research assistants, and in our case, and this is, I think, little emphasized, we were assisted by the head of the legal department of the German Foreign Office, Dr. Friedrich Gauss.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Gauss was an amazing individual. He was a legendary figure. He had been head of the German Foreign Office legal department since the early days of the Weimar Republic.
Right.
He was the father, I am told, of the Locarno Pax in 1925, in which Germany entered into bilateral treaties of non-aggression and also agreements to arbitrate with many of the European powers.
Right.
And and this was shortly after the shackles of the Versailles Treaty had been imposed. Hitler was just rising to power at the time. When the Weimar Republic fell, Dr. Gauss, like many of the career diplomats, just kept coming to the office, so to speak.
Right.
And he served Hitler, von Ribbentrop. He was not a Nazi, he was a functionary.
Right.
And very able. He was the author of the actual draft of the Non-Aggression Pact of 1939.
Oh, no kidding.
He had gone with von Ribbentrop to Moscow. In fact, I held a picture for a long time of the signing of that non-aggression pact. I have it here, in which von Ribbentrop, Molotov, and Stalin, I think Stalin is sitting at the table signing the pact, or Molotov and Stalin standing, von Ribbentrop. Somewhat much later, in fact, within recent years, someone sent me another picture, which was larger. That had been a cut picture. And standing next to von Ribbentrop was Dr. Gauss.
Now be darned.
He and I became very good friends. He was persuaded by Kempner, once Nazis had fallen, to more or less become our chief resource on the Foreign Office case, particularly the wars of aggression. So he and I worked very intimately, and I used to take him to our movies. They had films there, and he used to love Western movies because he liked the scenery,
Right.
you see. And he was of invaluable assistance to us. Kempner dominated him, I must say that. But he was used to being dominated. He had a technician's delight in going ahead with the project, but in a very self-effacing way. And when she came over to us, he was as loyal, strange as it may seem, as he had been to the Weimar Republic and to the Nazi regime. Because he was never a Nazi, as so many of the members of the Foreign Office were. They were not Nazis in the sense of sharing their philosophy or their inclinations to seize power and retain it in brutality. But it was his duty to serve the fatherland. And he was a great help to us. He pierced the arguments, in our case, of many of the defendants. And he would also tell us where evidence might be found, reliability of so-and-so, and so forth. So he worked very closely with us throughout the case.
Now, you had some interesting defendants there, and a few of them, I actually got some stuff out of a book that you might want to comment on. Hans Lammer, Dietrich. Do any of those personalities kind of jump out at you as unique individuals?
Yes, I know. Excuse me.
Sure.
Can you?
Yep.
I can.
Sure.
I had some money saved, but not too much. I took a little part-time.
You know, the expense is sounding like the guy from
And his brother that I met him.
Interview.
I've heard this whole conversation, but I liked it better when you caught the Duchess of Windsor.
Oh, well, we got to get to that.
that one.
That's a piece we'll have to get to.
Why don't I just review the defendants?
Sure, that'd be great if you would. Super.
But before we come to that, I think it may be a little premature.
Sure.
I don't want to take too long.
Oh no, my time is your time.
Oh, yeah.
She's got to be there 8 o'clock tonight. So.
Oh.
Oh, she doesn't have to do late. Come here, I'll show you something. Are you listening to that?
Sure, well, I'll follow you.
She has a little less interest in this than I do.
All right.
And mine's high though. I might add.
What I want to say is, I think after the Mills trial started, there was a great deal of intense work by all the groups, preparing the Krupp case, the Flick case, the Einsatzgruppen case, the medical doctors case, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
We, of course, were very there would be just the political ministers. And we had a number of other ministers that might qualify because of their involvement in criminality. But there was a tremendous change in the posture of the Western world, particularly in the United States, after the first trial, which greatly influenced the subsequent trials and is, I think, vital to consider that, because that was the framework in which the other trials took place. And as the trials progressed, the pressures increased
Right.
almost exponentially. At the first trial, there was tremendous support in the victorious nations of the world and in those nations that had been freed for the trials. And Mr. Jackson's stature and position and brilliance of presentation embellished the entire trial. However, one of the salient arguments during the trial, as I had mentioned earlier, was the Germans' contentions that the Russians were the real foe, and that we were foolish in having stopped them from destroying communism. And that argument at first trial seemed to be sour grapes, perhaps, to some extent, since they had been unsuccessful in their quest. Although they were really of the feeling that if there had been no second front, that they would have won. I'm not sure that's the case, but certainly a good argument could be made for it, and it was their belief. With the death of Roosevelt and Truman's coming on, and then the atomic bomb, you started to have a change. And in our Congress, isolationism, which had always been strong in the late 30s and early 40s, in fact, President Roosevelt had to maneuver to supply aid to Britain and the other allies in the years before we entered the war. There was a resurgence of that. Also, there seemed to be a general loss, gradual but increasing, of public interest in the trials, because 300, 400 journalists were there constantly, and they used to occupy the headquarters of the Faber Castle in First, outside of Nuremberg, and I've been there many times. Great place to party and drink, and also exchange information. But that diminished to some extent. Furthermore, the Russians extended their domination of Europe. The fall of Poland, democracy in Poland, the murder of Jan Masaryk, and the taking over of Czechoslovakia, the utter brutality of the communist regime in East Germany, all were embarrassments in a sense, because here you had one of the four powers committing the very acts, as far as crimes against humanity, and almost to a sense war crimes, that the Germans were accused of. And our own reporters were very concerned at that. I remember being in Vienna on business in a wintry day in January, snow piled high, and there were these trucks, construction-sized trucks, moving out of Vienna, going east to Russia. One was filled with nothing but doorknobs. Another had nothing but bathtubs that they had torn out of homes of residents. These were such novelties and such luxuries to them.
Right.
But it was that type of open spoliation. Of course, whole factories were moved. People were deported. Many soldiers who had been captured, Germans, Austrians, were still missing. And so with all of these conditions, there was a gradual erosion of support in the United States. And as the governments, the democratic governments in the East toppled, a real concern as to whether communism would sweep across to the Atlantic Ocean. And there was talk of possibility of war between the Western Allies and Russia. Of course, you may remember the Communist Party was excessively strong in Italy and France,
Right.
two vital supporters of the Western part. Meanwhile, our relations with the Russians, although amicable at Nuremberg, were never close with their prosecutorial staffs.
Like I said, was there any real interfacing between the two?
The only
Staffs?
interfacing was at parties,
Yeah.
and there the main problem was what do you do with these continual toasts, particularly in vodka? And the Russians seem to have bottomless pits in which they pour their liquor. But there wasn't any real association, and our ability to secure witnesses and documents was hampered. There wasn't very much cooperation.
Right.
East Berlin was not yet separated because you had the four-power quadpartite control of Berlin, but the rest of it was a sea of Russian domination
Right.
in East Germany. And we began to increasingly recognize the shift of opinion. It then became the foreign policy of our government to restore democracy to Germany, not necessarily because we were altruistic about democracy, but rather to have Germany reinstate the Wehrmacht as a bulwark against the Russians. And what we really foresaw, many of our people did, as a possible conflict starting in Germany as the Russians might try and sweep through Germany to the sea, particularly if France and Italy fell to the communists.
Mm-hmm.
So there were real concerns. I mean, these were not purely hypothetical. But of course, we could sense this, but we still had a task to do ourselves. We received a great deal of cooperation from the occupied countries. Such as Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and all the others, but it was getting increasingly difficult. There were pressures on them. Jan Masaryk, whom I knew quite well, because I handled a lot with Czechoslovakia, and his staff supposedly fell out of a window while being interviewed by the Russians, and his murder opened the way for the communist takeover. And in Hungary, I was personally involved because we were very interested in Admiral Horthy testifying, and we were unable to get him to do that at first. And so I was finally able to go out to see him. He had been held under house arrest in Germany since 1944, when he was deposed by Hitler when he refused to send Hungarian Jews to the east in Auschwitz. And he was, interestingly, and I'm not sure geographically where it was, but he was in a very fine chalet in a forested area, some distance from Nuremberg. And I went out there And I remember walking in, and there was a very narrow entranceway, but long, and on each side of it were the little horns of deer. There must have been hundreds of them, because this was a hunting lodge.
Right.
And apparently this was one of the great hunting preserves. And I met with him and his very charming daughter-in-law, who had been this wife of Horthy's son. And Horthy's son was a colonel in charge of the Imperial Guard in Hungary. And when the SS attacked the castle to take Horthy prisoner, the Imperial Guard resisted, and his son was killed in that action in 1944, I believe. And I enjoyed being with Horthy. He was very, very interesting, very charming, and very gracious. He was of the old world school. And I stayed with him about 4 or 5 days and finally persuaded him to come to Nuremberg, and he did testify there. And in fact, I had the pleasure of presenting him
Oh,
at
wow.
our trial. The pressures were increased too when there were visits from congressmen and senators, as I've mentioned
Mm-hmm.
in some of my talks. And many of these were, you might say, right of center and very anti-communist,
Right.
communistic. In fact, it was probably the start of what later became the McCarthy group. And unfortunately, we did not have the dominance of Mr. Justice Jackson and his close ties to President Roosevelt, which was a great bulwark during the first trial, because when Jackson spoke, you knew it was with the full authority of the president.
Right.
And in effect, we were told to try and get, this was particularly after the beginning of the Berlin blockade in June of 1948, that let's end the trials. And there was an effort made to not have our trial. And General Taylor Telford resisted very strongly, and we were supported by Lieutenant General Clay, who was the military governor. And Truman was fairly supportive, but
Mm-hmm.
he was caught in the crossfire of the need to reshape our foreign policy, which was definitely hostile to Russia. And Truman did not have any close ties to Stalin, so that the long association that Roosevelt had didn't carry over.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the reason, after our trial was the 11th, the High Command case followed us, but the High Command case was shorter, so it concluded about October of 1948, if I remember correctly. And our trial did not end until the verdict in April of 1949, I believe. April 23.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think you said that this is really the only American court to convict under the controversial aggression charge.
yes,
And you were very, you regarded that as at least it was regarded as a most courageous decision, one which excited widespread interest and comment because it really was the first time since the IMT to really address that issue.
that is correct.
Yeah.
Would you like me to comment on that?
Sure, if you would.
I didn't have enough really for my brother. Fully was a rat.
Before that, however,
Sure.
since
But I don't want to get you out of sync
no,
here.
no, you're not getting me out of sync. I want to. It's a subject with a wide range, so I would only want to address what you feel you're interested
Sure.
in. Did you want to just discuss, before we got to that aspect, the establishment of case number 11?
Sure. Let's do that. Absolutely.
Case number 11 started in November 1947, and we indicted some 23.
Mm-hmm.
The defendants, and I'll use this reference just
There you
to
go.
get them correctly, on names and so forth. Main defendant among the diplomats was the Secretary of State, number 2 man, Deputy to Ribbentrop, a very controversial and in fact noble figure in some ways, Baron Ernst von Weizsäcker. He was State Secretary, and he was succeeded in 1943 by Baron Steenbreck von Moyland when Weizsäcker became the German ambassador to the Holy See. Then the Reich Minister in chief of Hitler's Chancellery, which was a very important figure, Hans Heinrich Lammers.
Yeah.
And you have a picture of Lammers.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
But I have some pictures much later, and he was much more satanic. That picture of him was when he was a very young man,
Mm-hmm.
and he's barely recognizable. At the trial, he was hunched over. His face was lined with evil wrinkles, and he was a malevolent person, but very important.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Another, Paul Kerner was another of the defendants. See, these were all minister people. Hermann Goering's all-powerful deputy in the 4-year plan, and he was on the Central Planning Council of 3 during the war with Speer. SS Lieutenant General Gottlieb Berger, he was a close intimate of Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, and who had committed suicide
Mm-hmm.
before the trials. And he was also the SS chief of prisoners of war and head of the SS main office, and he was liaison to the occupied territories, which included Rosenberg and the Russian areas. So the reason I mention some of these, if our trials had taken place and concluded at the time of the first trial, many of these men would have been sentenced to death,
Right.
and rightfully so. Otto Dietrich was Hitler's press czar, and he was a very close intimate of Hitler. He was as powerful as Goebbels, although it was not publicized, because he controlled the press. And Goering and others would look to Dietrich for most of the PR work. Goebbels controlled the radios, entertainment, propaganda, but not the press.
Right.
Although technically Dietrich was a subordinate, but he was a subordinate who had the right hand of Adolf Hitler on his shoulder, and he was stationed with Hitler.
In fact, it's interesting, this little biographical piece here, it said, after Hitler murdered many of the SA leaders in the brutal blood purge of 34, Dietrich described the Fuhrer's shock at the moral degeneracy of the old comrades he had butchered. When Hess flew to England, Dietrich reported his death in an accident over enemy territory. Even as the Russians were winning on the Eastern Front, Dietrich continued to assert that the Soviet Union is finished.
Yes, and he was very powerful. He should have been the defendant rather than Pritchett.
Pritchett.
It was a grave mistake.
Right.
He was much higher and much more involved, and he would have been sentenced to death. Wilhelm Stuckart, who was state secretary under Frick and Himmler, and was another person deeply involved in their activities. Ernst Bohler, who was head of the so-called Auslandsorganisation, control of all German nationals outside of Germany, representing the party and the government. And he was a very engaging fellow. He and I personally got to know each other. Bola had really not been too involved in the criminal activities. And in fact, he was represented by a tall, very handsome, blonde attorney. And I think there may have been very interesting legal consultations. I know later he spent some time with her. He was acquitted, except for his membership in the SS, which he did not contest. As I mentioned, Schwerin von Krosigk, who was a very distinguished old-time German aristocrat, he was the Reich Minister of Finance. And with him were the presidents of the Reichsbank, Emil Puhl, and Karl Rasche of the Dresdner Bank. And they were, Puhl of the Reichsbank was involved in the collection of gold from Auschwitz and other places. And Paul Pleiger, the industrialist who was chairman of the mining and steel works and chairman of the huge Reichs complex, the Hermann Goering Works, was our industrialist. Now, these defendants so much for history. These defendants had been selected. At the time, as I mentioned, there had been pressure to close down the trials in November of 1947 when we started. Before that, Telford had to make some very difficult choices because it was contemplated that I think that there would be 3 trials, each separate, and for example, the ministry's trial would not have had people like Pleiger, Gottlieb Berger, possibly Stuckart, and Dietrich probably, but it would be concentrated mainly on the Foreign Office and other ministries like the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Agriculture. Economists, bankers, military men were excluded. And Telford finally, with whoever else made the choices with him, and I'm sure key members of his staff, like Sprecher and Kempner, and possibly consultation with our State Department and military governors, finally had to choose and squash this group into one trial. And this led to the consolidation of these various groups that had been working fairly independently. We were working principally on the Foreign Office and the Ministries group. There was a so-called Economic Division, and they all were coalesced into one. But actually, during the case, except for reasonably close coordination, we had two cases going.
Really?
The Political Ministries Division handled its defendants, and the Economic Division handled its defendants.
Okay.
And the general oversight over that was done by Taylor and Drex Spreckler, who was then deputy to Taylor, and the Political Ministries Division continued to be headed by Bob Kempner. And I think there were a couple of fellows who alternated as head of the Economic Division, so those cases were coalesced. While we were in the midst of our own presentation after the case got rolling, the pressures were greatly compounded by the declaration by Russia that Berlin would be blockaded. This occurred in June of 1948, and I think on June 23, although I'm not sure of the date exactly, 1948, Truman declared that we would not accept the blockade and we would begin the Berlin airlift. And it was in this tumultuous time, with pressures also arising from now groups that had organized after the first trial. There was the Stahlhelm group of veterans, particularly of the wars, and other veteran groups. There was another group of SS personnel, particularly the Waffen-SS, and there was a third leading group of leading German nationalists, and they kept putting pressures on the military governor to get the trials over with, and it was particularly difficult when we chose some of the defendants. For example, von Weizsäcker, he was an extremely highly regarded figure, and it was a difficult prosecution. He had a distinguished career. He had been in World War I as a naval officer and liaison to one of the most distinguished admirals who was at the Battle of Jutland. Then he joined the Foreign Office and had been in diplomatic posts in Switzerland, Bern. Before that, I think in Basel. He'd been ambassador to Norway and then ambassador to Switzerland before he came into the German Foreign Office. And he was head of the political division of the German Foreign Office in about 1937, when the preparations for the aggression against Austria started. When von Ribbentrop came in February 1938, replacing von Neurath, Baron von Neurath, who had been of the old school, you finally had at the head of the Foreign Office an out-and-out Nazi with no real diplomatic experience or social position, despite the von, which had been acquired by marriage.
Right.
So there was a gulf. There was no doubt in the German Foreign Office that they were not Nazis, most of them, but they were nationalists. This made the trial exceedingly difficult. Among the witnesses called by von Weizsäcker, who was the head of the Norwegian resistance movement, who was a bishop, also Bishop, I think, of Chichester, England, testified in his behalf that he had fought for maintaining peace, that he was a resistance leader. Lord Halifax gave an affidavit praising him.
Oh, is that right?
And the Vatican sent a Monsignor to testify in his behalf. So, with the change in political fortunes, and it really looked as if war was inevitable. And we were working in this atmosphere, and we were aware of all this, the pressures from various right-wing individuals in Congress particularly, the pressures from the press, criticism of the first trial by people like Luce and Robert Taft, who said was ex post facto law, particularly the wars of aggression. It made it a most interesting challenge.
Well, that sets the stage for really the verdict when you talk about Robert Taft and the whole attack on the war of aggression and that particular finding, that here we are 3 years later, that in fact there was such a finding for the only time in the subsequent Nuremberg trials, right?
That is true.
Yeah.
And that was, as shown in Telford Taylor's final report to the president, this was one of the high notes. In fact, we went beyond the first trial. In the first trial, on the aggressive war count, the indictment did not consider that the conquests of Austria and Czechoslovakia were crimes against peace. They said they were acts of aggression. So that during the decision in the first trial, the court noted time and again that these were aggressive acts, that these were acts that were clearly meant to conquer these small nations, either by overpowering them with threats or by force if necessary. But as they said in the first trial, there was no charge in the indictment that these were crimes against peace, so that any conquest before September 1, 1939, when war broke out, was not within their jurisdiction. The first trial acted under the London Charter of August 1945. However, Council Law Number 10, which was the successor in December of 1945, expanded the definition of crimes against peace to explicitly state included invasions. And that was the cornerstone on which we very proudly hung our hat. Now, there were 3 other trials that had tried to convict the particular defendants of aggressive war. The Krupp case, the Flick case, and one involving the generals.
Mm-hmm.
In all 3 cases, the tribunals, in one case I think with a dissent, said industrialists and military men who were the particular defendants were not high enough or deeply enough involved in the establishment of policy to be found guilty, even though they were clearly involved within the definitions of preparing, planning, initiating, and waging aggressive war. So when we came to our case, except for the first trial, we had a very empty plate on that count. And we established two things. One, for the first time since the first trial, this last trial, which was sort of another IMT trial, found defendants guilty of aggressive war. For example, Paul Kerner was clearly guilty, Goering's deputy in Haltzow, Lammers, the Reich Chancellery, was also guilty.
Right.
And Kepler, of the German Foreign Office, and Weizsäcker and Werner. And we were delighted with that, of course I was, particularly. But secondly, they went beyond the IMT to hold that as a matter of law, any nation that is able to force another